Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at the developments of the 15th century in terms of architecture and sculpture, and how Brunelleschi and Donatello paved the way for bringing back the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome within the arts. And we're going to take a look at how that is manifest within painting as well. That these themes of going back, this of antiquity, is a big part of the Renaissance. We're going to take a look at how artists have been inspired by this. I wanted to mainly kind of step back just a little bit and go back to the Middle Ages and take a look at what is known as the father of the Renaissance. And this is Petrarch. And Petrarch was a writer, a poet during the Middle Ages. He was once studying to become a Catholic priest. But as he was preaching one Sunday, he looked out and he fell in love with a person in his congregation, and he said, "I can't keep my priestly vows," and so he left and spent the rest of his life wooing her, and her name is Laura. Right, and this is what he writes about love, and what we're going to see within his writings is he's starting to step away from the ideas of Christian thought, that Catholicism was the only way to see the world, that he starts this kind of stepping away what is known as secularism and appreciating life for what it is rather than having to place everything within the paradigm of Catholicism. Here's what he says about love. He says, "I find no peace and have no arms for war. My jailer opens not nor locks the door. No binds me to here, nor will loose my ties. Love kills me not, nor breaks the chains I wear, nor wants me living, nor will grant me ease. I have no tongue, and shout eyeless I see. I long to perish, I beg for aid. I love another, and myself I hate. Weeping I laugh, I feed on misery, by death and life so equally dismayed. For you, my lady, I'm in this state." And so he talks about this immense pain and suffering that he's in, but it's also the sense of joy and elation. He feels as though he's locked into some type of prison, but there is no jailer who locks the doors. He has no chains, right? The chains are within his heart, within his being wrapped within his emotions. And something like this in the earlier part of the Middle Ages would never have existed. Everyone would have been writing about poems about being devoted to God or being devoted to Mother Mary, something along those lines. But here Petrarch says maybe there's something that we can learn within this idea of secular love. Maybe God has provided secular love for us to be able to learn something about ourselves, about humanity. And so this idea of focusing on humanity becomes an integral part of the Renaissance. And when Brunelleschi and Donatello go down to Rome to study ancient architecture, they have these ideas on their mind. Let's step away from just doing things the way we've always done them, to stepping into tradition and Catholicism. Let's find other ways to represent that. Another major influence, we've talked about Giotto before when we've compared his Madonna Enthroned to Cimabue Madonna Enthroned. But he too, coming around, maybe just a little bit early, but roughly around the same time as Petrarch, we have this idea of focusing on realism. And so on one side with Petrarch, he's focusing on secular love or secularism or humanism as it's going to be called. And then on the other side, we have this focus on realism. And what this one is known as on the right-hand side by Giotto, this is known as the Lamentation. This is when they take Christ off the cross and he's surrounded by saints who mourn his loss. And so what we see is this emphasis on their realistic emotions, how someone standing above him, I believe it's John, standing above him, has his arms extended, looking down below as though he is trying to come to terms with this. And then we have Mary, his mother, who's holding him in her arms, and just kind of coming to terms with the loss of Jesus and what this means and why this has had to come to pass. And even the angels in the sky are mourning the loss, right? So that great deal of emotion is embedded within Giotto's works. And so these two ideas are going to be primarily influential for Renaissance artists. Another major concept, just thinking about the intellectual climate and some of the context of where artists are coming from, what ideas are inspiring them. We've talked about art reflecting its era, the era in which it was created. So let's take a look at some of the intellectual developments during this time. One of the major developments during the 1400s was that of humanism. This idea of secularism and stepping away from religious thought to study humanity in and of itself. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't like religion or they didn't like Catholicism. That's not the case. They just wanted to study life for what it is, study human beings for what they are, and not have to fit everything within the confines of Catholicism. And so what we see with humanism or humanities, or the Studia Humanitatis as it was known at the time, was they were seeking other ways to see the world. And so they were studying ancient Arabic, they were studying ancient Latin, they were studying ancient Greek, and they wanted these old manuscripts to see what writers used to say about who am I, why am I here, where am I going? And what they were looking for were commonalities between them. What do people say in ancient Greece? What do they say in ancient Latin, right? What do they say in ancient Arabic? And if they have commonalities, maybe these commonalities suggest universal truths. And so what they're really looking for is the capital T truth, right? Things that are common for everybody. But what they're also doing is they're seeking to liberate the mind, right? Past biases. They realize the Middle Ages may have made some wrong conclusions and they want to correct them, that we can't just heavily rely upon tradition because tradition could be wrong. We need to look for instead truth, right? So they're looking to liberate the mind from old biases of the Middle Ages. Another major development during this time was the fall of Constantinople. What happened with the fall of Rome was when Rome was sacked and starting to break apart during the early part of the Middle Ages, it's decided to divide between the East and the West instead of the West. And the West went to Rome, and the East went to, the center of the East was in Constantinople. By and large, for the most part of the Middle Ages, Constantinople remained intact. They were able to function much like the Roman Empire did in antiquity. They were largely, they had a strong government, they had a strong currency, they had a strong military, and so they, for the most part, functioned pretty regularly throughout the Middle Ages, and they were largely untouched by this dissolution that we see that happens in the West. But what happens is in 1454, it is overrun by Ottoman Turks. They come in, they sack the city, and they kind of tear it to the ground. And so at this point, then the Eastern Empire starts to dissolve as well. What happens as a result, what's important about this to our discussion, is the scholars start leaving from the east to the west, going to other places like Rome and Florence, and what they are bringing with them is ancient manuscripts. And so they bring these ancient manuscripts of these older writers to this hotbed of intellectual activity, which is looking for ancient manuscripts. They're looking for things written in Greek and Latin so they can liberate the mind. They're looking for original documentation so that they can find capital T truth. And so what we see is the fall of Constantinople only ignited this fervor of education and intellectualism and development during the Renaissance. One of the major ideas that is part of this fall of Constantinople and this humanism is what is known as Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism refers, neo means new, and then Plato, right, is the center part of this. They have this new appreciation of Aristotle's ideas. During the Middle Ages, mainly it was Aristotle that was the central focus. But during the Renaissance, Plato becomes more and more appreciated, and a lot of these scholars fleeing from Constantinople brought these ancient manuscripts of Plato with them, and so people were able to read these manuscripts and see what ideas that he said, what were the arguments that Plato was making, and they start looking for common truth, and they said, hey, Plato is arguing this, and it has this in common with Christianity, that must be a universal truth. Mainly Plato's philosophy, he argues that there are two realms to the universe. There's the physical realm, the realm that we all live in, and then there's the eternal realm, the realm of the divine, the realm of the gods. And mainly what he argues is that these two realms, the physical realm is always changing, but the eternal realm is constant, the realm of ideas, the realm of abstraction. So for instance, if you think about a dog has generally 4 legs, a tail, and barks, right? That is the concept of the eternal realm. However, if you take a look at the physical realm, he starts with a puppy. The puppy grows older and eventually will die. That's part of the physical realm. That's the temporary realm. What Plato argues is that we need to transcend the physical and focus more on this eternal realm, this never-changing world, to be able to aspire to this eternal divine, right? Very similar to what we see with Christianity. Christianity says to forsake the physical and focus more on the eternal. And so they see that idea and they say, yes, that is a concept that is true. That is something that is a universal fact. And so they start... So humanists are really interested in that. And this is going to heavily influence artists. Artists are going to be heavily influenced by Platonic thought. Thinking about Plato's ideas, two ways that he says that we can reach this eternal realm. One is through mathematics, because mathematics is a concept that is never changing. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. And so that is something that is assured, that's something that is true, and so something that we can rely on. Plato argues that mathematics is the language of God. And so it transcends any language, it transcends any dialect. It's always going to be the same. It's always something that you can rely on. And so therefore, God uses mathematics to create his works. And so they argue that the universe is founded on mathematical principles. And so if we're to understand God or the language of God, we need to study mathematics. That's going to be heavily influential for artists because they're going to take a look at implementing mathematics within their works. Things have to be symmetrical, things have to be balanced and harmonious within their works because they're trying to imitate the creations of God. They're trying to reach that eternal realm. The other way is the realm of love, right? The ideas of love. That's one way that we can transcend this physical world and reach the eternal world. I wanted to show you a clip from the Sappi film of The Notebook, which you see a image from, a still frame, of Noah and his love interest. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but this is at the very end. This is the kind of the last shot of the film, and so there are some spoilers here. But I wanted to take a look. Mainly, she is suffering from dementia, and so she can't remember her life. And so what Noah does, is he comes and he brings the notebook, which is the story of their life, the story of their love, to her. He reads that every day and hopes that this will help her to remember them, right? So I just wanted to show you a clip at the very end. What we're going to see is she's kind of bedridden at this point, and he comes in to visit her, not really sure whether she's going to remember him or not, and then they have this kind of platonic encounter. Seems like a sad story because they die, but when you think about it in Platonic sense, their love, their physical love in this world transcends beyond, and they're able to unite. And the film alludes to this love continuing on even into the eternities, right? So this idea of that Plato's philosophy becomes extremely important, influential within the Renaissance, and it continues on even to this day. This idea that love goes on forever, right? We even have that idea within the church, right? This idea of celestial marriage, transcending beyond the physical and reaching to the eternal realm. And what the humanists are looking for are commonalities to find that capital T truth. I want to take a look at Mirandola, Pico della Mirandola, and his oration on the dignity of man. Mirandola was a humanist that was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, the ideas of Plato, and this is what he concludes. And so he's thinking about what is the meaning of life, why are we here, where are we going, right? Those kind of big questions. And he's taken ideas from all of these other sources, and then he summarizes the meaning of life. And I want to just take a look at these two brief paragraphs in his much longer work to help summarize how does the Renaissance see humanity. And then we're going to take a look at how these ideas are manifest within the arts, how artists are influenced by this. He says, God the Father, the supreme architect of the universe. Listen to how he's referring to Heavenly Father, right? He's the supreme architect. He's a builder like unto Brunelleschi, right? He's an artist like unto Donatello, right? Build this home, this universe we see all around us, a venerable temple of his Godhead, through the sublime laws of his ineffable mind. And so this idea that he created this world for us, this temple for us. And so as we think about what artists are going to do, they're going to say, well, if God created this world for us and patterned it after him, then we should pattern art after God. And so they're going to focus on the idea of realism. The expanse above the heavens he decorated with intelligences, the spheres of heaven with living eternal souls. Finally, the great artisan, again, notice how he's referring to God, mandated this creature who had received nothing proper to himself shall have joint possession of whatever nature he had been given to any other creature. He made a creature of indeterminate nature and placing him in the middle of the world. And so God created everything. And he says, you know what? I need something to be able to truly appreciate this. So he created humanity after God's own image. But he gives them this, as he says, this indeterminate nature, this nature that's not yet quite formed. Right? There's something else out there. Everything else, right? A bear is going to be a bear. A lion's going to be a lion. A squirrel is going to be a squirrel, right? But humanity is indeterminate. We have the capability to determine our own form. The great artisan states, Adam, we give you no fixed place to live, no form that is particular to you, nor any function that is yours alone. According to your desires and judgments, you will have and possess whatever place to live, whatever form and whatever functions you yourself choose. You, with no limit or no bound, may choose for yourself the limits and bounds of your nature. We have placed you at the center, world center, so you may survey everything else in the world. We have made you neither of heavenly nor of earthly stuff, neither mortal nor immortal. So with that free choice and dignity, you may fashion yourself in whatever form you choose. And to you is granted the power contained in your intellect and judgment to be reborn into higher forms, the divine, right? So he gives humanity the idea to have agency, free will, that we can choose what we can be. We can choose to be animals or we can choose to be divine. That's entirely up to us. What the other animals don't have in creation is that ability to choose their own character, to choose their own nature, right? So that's something that is unique to humanity. And I think we take a look at this in church, we're like, wow, that's really cool. Someone's writing about this idea of agency is super important. That's awesome. But what we also kind of miss within that is how radical that idea was coming out of the Middle Ages, where they argued that God knows everything, God controls everything, so therefore God has created all of these conditions, and we are just merely pawns in God's chess game of life. That we don't really have free will because God has chosen everything before we were even born. And so the Middle Ages mainly argued for this idea of predestination, that we were already given whatever lot we were given. What we see during the Renaissance is that they're suggesting that's not the case. As they take a look at all of these diverse ideas, they're starting to assimilate them into this kind of consolidated idea, looking for truth, and they say, well, the truth is humanity has the ability to choose. And that's where we have Michelangelo. We'll take a look at him in a little bit later, but what we have with his creation is God is reaching out towards humanity, right? Kind of reaching, directing, and humanity that he shows here, Adam, before he's given the gift of life, is choosing to reach back. Right? Having that gift of agency to reach to that divine, to reach to that eternal realm, right? Michelangelo is heavily influenced by Neoplatonic thought, heavily influenced by humanism, right? The idea is that the humans are the center of God's creation, we're fashioned after his image, and we have the ability to choose our own destinies, right? So just to think about some other works that we've been studying before, just to kind of bring these ideas together, what I would like you to think about, and we'll probably do this in one of the Zoom assignments, but I just want to get you thinking about this. What are the common styles, themes, and elements of early Renaissance art that you've noticed so far? Do you see any of these ideas about realism, about fashioning our images within art after the images of God? Do you see the ideas of the emphasis on agency and choice, right? What would you say unites this era as you find these common aspects? Think about three aspects that the works have in common the most, right? Let's take a look at some of the major aesthetic influences of the early Renaissance, and this is going to continue on into the High Renaissance, and they'll change slightly when we get to the Late Renaissance or Mannerism. Mainly what we're going to see is this classical influence, this idea of going back to the ancient Greek and Roman influences. That's before the Middle Ages. They want to do something quite different. And so this is where Brunelleschi goes to Rome to study the dome. This is where Donatello goes to Rome to study sculptures. They're trying to bring these ideas back, and humanists are doing this. The scholars of the day, the humanists, are doing this by going back to ancient manuscripts. And so it's the same effort, the same endeavor, just in different forms, right? And whether it's in writing or whether it's in the arts, right? Some major focus within arts is a focus on idealism, not just focusing on something that is ordinary, but something that transcends the ordinary and reaches that eternal space, as Plato suggests. Or this emphasis on realism, that God created the world, and so we as artists are to fashion the world after God's creation. There's a sense of emotion within their works, but the emotion is going to be more refined. It's going to be this kind of strained emotion, this kind of stoicism, where you're going to have this inner strength and inner fortitude. There's going to be an eternal yearning within the works. The artists are going to represent characters that are looking past this physical realm, looking beyond it into the divine, peering into the eternities. There's going to be an emphasis on mathematics, since mathematics is the language of God according to Plato, and they're heavily influenced by Plato. Having things focus on mathematical symmetry and harmony is going to be key. Classicism and Christianity, this kind of blending with classical forms with Christian subjects is going to be key. And there's going to be a rising status of the artist, that artists are not going to be just simply considered craftsmen, but they're going to be considered people that have tremendous, profound insights, like philosophers or like quasi-prophets. And so you're going to see the status of the artist begin to raise during the Renaissance. Let's take a look at one of the major developments in painting for the Renaissance, and that is an experiment that Brunelleschi did in 1420. So in addition to trying to solve the very complex problem of the cathedral dome in Florence, on the side, he said, you know what, let's solve something within painting too. Why not? I don't have enough on my plate as it is. And so what he does is he develops linear perspective. And linear perspective is going to dominate the arts for the next about 500 years or so. It's going to be the major focus, right? And what he does here is he has this idea that there are these orthogonal lines that meet at the central axis within the painting. And then what he does is he paints it according to those mathematical principles where all lines will converge into one central point, right? This kind of one-point perspective. And then what he does, so he stands out in front of the Florence Baptistry, which we've seen the octagon-shaped building before. And then he paints it according to his mathematical principles of all the lines converging on the central axis. Then what he does is he drills a hole into the central axis of the painting, as you see on the image. And then he holds up a mirror and then drills a hole into the handle of the mirror. That way he can look through and he can see both the reflection of the painting through the mirror, and because he can see through the handle, he can stand in front and see where he was originally painting. Right? You can actually see the Florence Baptistry. And what he argued is he's like, I can't tell the difference, right? So he says this mathematically must be correct. And so artists start becoming inspired by this idea, focusing again on mathematics, focusing on realism, trying to mimic how the eye actually sees, right? With that, let's turn to some artists and how we see these ideas manifest within painting, right? Masaccio was inspired by Giotto's realism of the body and Brunelleschi's understanding of 3D space, this idea of linear perspective. Notice how the lines push the viewer to the background, right? We see that barrel vaulting in his Holy Trinity that pushes the viewer back, that gives us that sense of space, that the figures in the foreground are closer to us than the objects in the background. Notice how he also places this within an ancient architecture space with the columns that gives us that harkening back to these classical forms. The figures in the background are a little bit smaller than life-size, except for Christ, who's a little bit larger to demonstrate his kind of symbolic role within Christianity, and he dominates that center part of the canvas. Notice how that there's a straight line between God the Father, the Holy Ghost right above Jesus' head, and then Christ to show the Holy Trinity in one straight line. And then God holds Christ up on a cross as though he's doing some type of curls or something, some type of exercise, lifting Christ up to suggest that there is a connection, that this had to be, that this was all part of a plan, right? The figures appear like sculpted images, like unto Donatello, right? They are posed like classical forms, and they appear with this kind of potential energy or movement. Mary at the left points to Jesus, and you can see kind of her, and generally Mary is represented within blue robes because the blue hue was so expensive at the time. They didn't really use it a lot except for important people, and she was an important person. So iconography suggests that when you see a blue figure, most of the time it's going to be someone in royalty, or more often than not it's going to be Mary, and then she has a halo above her head to represent her divinity. And then John on the right looks up in reverence and awe, suggesting I'm kind of praying to this figure. And then at the very foreground, you have the patrons, who are the ones that are paying for the art. They kind of kneel in humble reverence to suggest that their piety, they're the ones paying for this, so they get to be there, but it also is kind of an advertisement for their righteousness, right? And just thinking about this and how it's representing this kind of holy space. Let's take a look at a couple other images by Masaccio. This one is in the same chapel, the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. These are both in that same room, and so you can see the room on the top right-hand side. I want to take a look at the tribute money, then we'll take a look at the expulsion in just a second. In the tribute money, we see Christ telling Peter to gather money from a fish to go and pay the tax collector, and we see all three of those, right? So we see Christ at the center telling Peter to go and find the coin in the fish, and in the far left, we see Peter that is going and pulling the coin out of the fish's mouth, and then on the far right, we see Peter paying the Roman centurion or guard or tax collector, I suppose, which is wearing something a little bit too short of a robe, but he's paying the Roman tax collector, paying him off, right? What we see here is that the figures occupy this three-dimensional space, right? Peter on the left is smaller than he is in the center, which kind of gives us this illusion of depth. The space is providing that illusion. In the expulsion, what we see on the far left, right? This is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and you can see the kind of the gates that they're walking through, and then the angel with the sword that's kind of evicting them from the garden, right? Here we see the consequence of sin. We see the real pain of Adam and Eve as they leave the gates of paradise, and the angel with the sword moving them out, right? This is shame. Adam does not cover his body, as you would think he would. Instead, he's covering his face. This is his consequence of sin, of sinning against God, right? And this is juxtaposed against Eve, who doesn't cover her face, right? She covers herself instead. But by not covering her face, we're able to see her real emotion. This is not about celebrating choice. It's not necessarily even about the plan of salvation per se, even though this is a Catholic image, and so that concept would be somewhat foreign. But this is what happens when people refuse to obey God. We see the beauty and strength of the human form that's being celebrated by Masaccio. Notice how Adam's arms are a little too short, though. Right? So he's trying to get this idea of realism. It's a little bit off. It's a little bit early for that. And Eve's left arm's a little too short. But this is one of the first times we see the anatomy being emphasized in over 1,000 years, right? At least in painting. Note that a later person came to paint over the private parts of Adam and Eve with a brush, but then it's been restored back to its original. But in context, right, as we think about the tribute money and expulsion in context, what we see is what happens with faith. God will provide if you obey him. But if you don't obey him, you're going to suffer the consequence of sin and expulsion. And so as you go into this Brancacci Chapel in Florence, it tells a story. It tells a story to people who are able to see it, right? Of the day, they're able to see what happens when you are faithful and what happens when you're not. And it even has that kind of profound message even to this day. Let's take a look at a couple other Florence painters. This one's Fra Angelico, and his most famous image is the Annunciation. This image represents a real monastery in Florence, San Marco, seen here. And what he wants to do is he wants to give us this sense of space to make it feel as though it's a real world, right? So you can see the columns, and they look just like San Franco or San Marco, right? So this sense of real space that's being represented. The friars can observe it, and they can feel that they're part of this divine scene as they walk past it. They can say, oh, this they can feel connected to this eternal, this divine space, to transcend the physical and reach to the eternal, as if they are witnessing it. Notice how Fra Angelico separates the heavenly scene from the outer world within this particular image. The greens and the browns of the worldly space, and the trees and the fences are very different from the celestial space inside the building with Gabriel and Mary, right? So this is the Annunciation, when Gabriel comes and announces that Mary will be the mother of Jesus, right? The building occupies a sacred space apart from the world with its pinks, blues, and yellow hues. Notice how Mary kind of has this subtle gesture, and it mimics Gabriel's, right? He's bowing in reverence to her and her kind of divinity within Christendom, and she's bowing in reverence and acceptance to this divine calling, right? So they're both kind of bowing to each other. Notice how the figures are a little bit larger than life. If you take a look at the actual scene from San Marco in Florence, Mary would have to be about 10 feet tall for this to actually work. But he places her within a kind of this realistic setting, but he emphasizes her size to represent her importance within Christendom, right? So they're a little bit too large, but it's to demonstrate the gravity of the moment and the importance of it. Just wanted to show just this image here of me walking up to it in San Marco in Florence. This is a fresco, and it's just at the top of the stairs. As you walk in, you're able to see and interact with this. And it has this interesting kind of connection between this real world space of San Marco and then this kind of divine heavenly scene that's being witnessed, right? Let's take a look at a couple other artists. Sandro Botticelli was one of the favorite artists of the Medicis, and we're going to see something a little bit different within his works. We've been taking a look mainly at religious works and how the Renaissance has captured religious images. What we're going to see with Botticelli and a couple other artists that we're going to study after him is we're going to take a look at how artists of the Renaissance capture non-religious or secular images. And so demonstrating how these ideas, as they're going back to these ancient Greek and Roman ideas, and they're bringing these ideas forward within the Renaissance, the artists are going to be inspired by these ideas too and going to reflect them, right? And so Botticelli was one of the major artists of the Medicis, and this was painted for a cousin of Lorenzo Medici, probably for a wedding, right? So the content of the work, what it's about is this is the beginning of spring. Venus here at the center. She takes center stage. There's almost a halo. Notice the halo almost around her, shown by kind of this natural lighting as the forest kind of parts, and we can see the lighting from the sky that gives her this sense of halo. And so even though she's not a Christian figure, she's still a divine figure within mythology. And so he kind of brings that idea back, even though he's representing this secular space, right? This is her sacred forest, what is known as Cythera. The three graces are at the left-hand side, right? The three graces kind of surround her. Generally, they're there to show the human body in three different angles, right? So we can see the front, the back, and then two of the sides. They generally capture this kind of perspective, different perspectives of women. Mars or Mercury at the very, sometimes people say it's Mars, some people say it's Mercury, at the very far left-hand side. He kind of reaches up with a stick and he's pushing away these storm clouds. He's bringing forth spring, and so he's kind of pushing that away, right? If he's Mars, then he is one of the love interests of Aphrodite, but here Mars is the god of war. He is at peace. He's subdued by the intoxicating powers of spring and love, right? Primavera is spring. Venus is the goddess of love. And so this is about spring and the excitement of love within the spring, right? Zephyrus, who is on the far right-hand side, he is the west wind. And he abducts Chloris here, who is a nymph of spring. And as he abducts her, she emerges as Flora, bringing flowers, the flowers of spring, right? This kind of growth and fertility of spring to the world, right? Above Venus's head is her sun, according to some myths. According to some myths, it's the sun. According to other myths, it's not. But this is Cupid, who is pointing his arrow, right? He's taking aim to, and it's kind of interesting. He's kind of blindfolded here, so you never know where that arrow is going to land. It just might land on you one day, right? And then, so the idea is he's bringing love, kind of this intoxicating power, this celebration of this kind of secular love rather than religious love. And the trees around are full in bloom to show the fertility and life of spring. And the scene captures energy, passion, and love that occur all within, the primavera, within spring. The characters, notice how the characters are weightless. They kind of float, kind of mythically. They're kind of timeless. You don't really know what time of day this is. It gives us this sense that it's away from the world, it's away from the physical. They're frozen in their positions. But what we see here, the main idea that I want us to think about is this is an embrace of Greek and Roman ideas. This is a celebration of love, as we see with Plato celebrating love, but this is a different type of love than the piety and love for religion that we see with Fra Angelico or Masaccio, right? There's a different type of love being celebrated. This is Petrarch's ideas put into practice. Where during the Middle Ages there was no outside religion, now mythologies have something to teach. We say this in the church, that there's truth in all things, right? So they're kind of picking up on that idea, right? Truth can be found even in pagan ideas, right? Love can be a driving factor for humanity, and it's not always negative and should be shunned. It can be examined, right? How humans love, and we can find something of value within that because we can reach beyond ourselves and find a better way to live better and be more pious. Just a couple of close-up images of details. The details of the graces. I just love the translucence of the fabric that Botticelli is able to capture here, which we can see through, right? Or as we see the close-up of the dress of Flora, it has that kind of silk feel to it. But even on the dress, there's this flowers, right? There's kind of life, growth, fertility that's being celebrated. This just gives you the sense of the size of the work. Sometimes it's hard to see to get a sense of how large these works are, but this one is in the Uffizi, which was it used to be the Medici's office building when they were in power, and then later it was turned into to a museum. But thinking about these two works, I want you to think about how they're representing the divine and how they're doing it slightly. What are the similarities and what are the differences between how they view eternity and how they're representing that through the arts? I want to take a look at this one as well. This one is also another major work of Botticelli's. This is The Birth of Venus. And this was extremely radical for its day because this is the first life-size nude female. We've seen the first life-size nude male with Donatello's David, but that one was a scriptural person. This one is a mythical person, which is a different context and a different kind of meaning. and it is a kind of a game changer, right? So before the last 100 years, 100 years ago, this would not have been allowed. But during the Renaissance, they're starting to take a look at, well, what do we value? What is important? Let's value the ideas of creation. Let's value the ideas of life and the human body. And so we start seeing more of these ideas kind of stepping away from the rigid traditionalism of the Middle Ages. What we see here, according to legend, Venus emerges from the sea and she's whisked to shore in the island of Cythera, where we see kind of the trees on the right hand side. Flora here grabs a kind of a cloak to cover her up as she comes ashore, and we see Zephyr kind of blowing her to shore to kind of bring her in to focus on her life. Generally within mythology, gods are born with all attributes, and so generally they're represented born as full-grown entities, and so that's why she is full-grown here. But the idea of the birth of Venus is this is a celebration of love. This is a celebration of this idea of secular love that can transcend. That's one way that we can transcend the physical world and reach the eternal. One way that we can tell Botticelli's works of art is because all the women look the same, because it uses the same model for every single woman that he represented. And so that's one way you can tell Botticelli's style, is because they will all look the same. And it's not just Botticelli that does this. Most artists will have models that they like to use, that they'll like to return to. There's something about the facial features that they like. And so you'll see often that artists will return to the same study again and again, the same subject. Ghirlandaio was another major artist that was influenced by humanism and secular themes. This one is another representation of love, but it's a little bit different than what we've seen before. It's not necessarily religious love. It's not necessarily, this idea of passion love either. This is something about that transcends generations, right? The man is disfigured by rosacea. The two occupy, the man and the young boy occupy a single gaze as they're looking at each other. The child sees past the old man's nose to view something he loves and admires. He doesn't see the nose, which we all do. The old man lovingly looks back at the boy. There's this connection between them, the connection between generations. The hearts of the fathers turn to the sons and the sons to the fathers. And the window provides this space and this atmospheric perspective. And so it provides that three-dimensional quality that gives us this sense of life beyond, but there's this kind of eternal kind of connection between the grandfather, I would assume, and then the grandson, perhaps. We don't really know exactly who's being represented here, but traditionally that's how it's seen. I like this quote here because it helps us to think about beauty in painting, what beauty really is. In the arts, there are often examples of great beauty, but they're not always pretty, right? And so as we think about Renaissance, they're thinking about this idealism representing things that are beautiful, right? What we see with Botticelli's works is the ideal of beauty, the ideal beauty of womanhood. What we see with Donatello and his David, the ideal of manhood, right? But not always, right? Why would Ghirlandaio include something that's so obviously grotesque in this painting? Not only is its graphically ugly nose a dominant feature in the painting, it also happens to fall directly in line of sight between the old man and the young boy. As you examine this masterpiece, you come to realize that the beauty of the painting is because of, not in spite of, that ugly nose. We, the viewers, see it all too plainly, but the grandson, with his eyes fixed directly towards that ugly nose, sees beyond. He alone is oblivious. I suppose this painting is an example of what the Lord meant when he said we should become as little children, who are so loving and forgiving. This is an example of what beautiful or lovely that goes much deeper than fleeting superficial characteristics. And so this idea of capturing this kind of love, this connection, this eternal connection that transcends the physical and reaches beyond the generations, right? But again, things to think about, connecting the dots between artists and ideas, right? Contrasting Ghirlandaio with Botticelli. I would like you to contrast Botticelli's Primavera with Ghirlandaio's The Old Man and the Boy, and how does each one represent love differently, right? A different kind of emphasis, right? The idea being connected between them. All right, we'll leave off with our discussion of Florence painting. We'll come back a little bit later and we'll take a look at some other later artists and what they're doing, but this is a good foundation for thinking about the main ideas of not only the Renaissance, but specifically Renaissance painting.